In 1984, The Economist magazine printed an article about the issue of the moment, acid rain. It said this: forests are beginning to die at a catastrophic rate. 1 year ago, West Germany estimated that 8% of its trees were in trouble. Now, 34% are. That forests are in trouble is now indisputable. The author of that article went on to relate the view of experts that all Germany's conifers would be gone by 1990, and that the Federal Ministry of the Interior predicted that all forest would be gone by 2002. That author was Matt Ridley. He now says he was a gullible idiot for having written it, and he says this: the story of acid rain is not of catastrophe averted, but of minor environmental nuisance somewhat abated. The BBC still thinks it's a problem. It says this on its website: at its worst, acid rain stripped forests bare in Europe, wiped lakes clear of life in parts of Canada and the US, and harmed human health and crops in China, where the problem persists. Climate scientist Michael Mann is also in no doubt. In his latest book, he says this: one of these scientific issues was acid rain, a phenomenon I'm intimately familiar with, having grown up in New England during the 1970s. At that time, lakes, rivers, streams and forests throughout eastern North America were being destroyed by increasingly acidic rainfall. My family frequently goes on vacation to Big Moose Lake in the western Adirondacks. My wife's family has been going there for 70 years. Her parents remember back in the 1970s when the lake was so acidic the waters were crystal clear because they were lifeless. The wildlife has returned now. So who's right? Was acid rain a significant environmental problem that got solved? Or was it all overblown, a minor inconvenience? And not only that, there's a bigger story behind how acid rain changed forever how we now deal with issues such as climate change. So, let's have a look. In the late 1960s, Swedish soil scientist Svant Oden raised the alarm over acid rain. Now, he wasn't the first to notice the phenomenon, but he was the first to realise that it might be a real problem for the environment, and he was sufficiently alarmed to publish his findings in Dagens Nyheter, Sweden's most popular daily newspaper, before even submitting them for peer review. In that article, he argued that emissions of sulfur dioxide were causing acid rain and damaging ecosystems. He said that it was contributing to fish extinctions, and he thought there was possible damage to soils and forest. There were a number of things that were new here. The proposition was that sulfur dioxide pollution was not just making an impact on a very local level, but that it was travelling significant distances. That pollution emitted in one country was causing environmental harm in another. That was new. Then there was the nature of the damage itself, the impact of which wasn't understood. His article gained attention, as you would expect, and the following year, at a conference in April 1968, they'd established that the effects of sulfur dioxide were visible in many places, some of which were very far away from any potential industrial source, and that some areas were collecting rain with pH as low as 2.8, which is not far off that of vinegar. In an age where we're used to international scientific collaborations on such things, it's worth noting there was no mechanism for this at this time. We had an international scientific problem. We had no history or mechanism for how you should deal with such a thing. The United Nations was there, it was international, but it was non-scientific, it was cumbersome, so it ended up as a proposal of the OECD's Environment Committee, which eventually agreed to take it forward. But the politics became inescapable. Britain, France and West Germany all realised that the logical outcome of this work was that they were going to get blamed for pollution that damaged other countries. They threatened to pull out of the pilot project. All sorts of politics had to be navigated to get it to happen, but it did eventually go ahead. And by the end of the first stage of the project, the study had generated sound estimates of each country's contribution to the pollution levels of its neighbours. 5 of the 11 countries taking part were subjected to more pollution than they themselves generated, and Scandinavia as a whole was getting 2/3 of its pollution from somewhere else. At the OECD Environment Committee, Great Britain repeatedly tried to alter recommendations to not include references to acid rain or the need to reduce fossil fuel emissions. They criticised the idea that there should be equal right of access to justice, the idea that foreign parties affected by pollution should be given the same rights to remediation as citizens from the polluting nation itself. In the event, Britain was able to weaken the recommendations with the removal of all references to the need to reduce emissions. While all this was going on in Europe, North America had a similar process going on there. Gene Likens and F. Herbert Borman discovered acid rain at the Hubbard Brook Station in the White Mountains. They produced an article, which was picked up by the New York Times, that gained immediate political attention. What happened next was hugely significant in the development of how science does or doesn't inform policy making. The energy industry in both the UK and the US began to consider the implications of acid rain, particularly for their bottom line. And they considered how they could make sure that their interest would be represented in the political debates to come. Now, there had been various industries in the past that had attacked research that incriminated them, tobacco and lead in paint, for instance. But the coal industries in the US and in Britain decided to develop their own body of experts to do defensive research on behalf of the industry. According to Rachel Emma Rothschild in her book Poisonous Skies, within 2 years of Likens and Borman's paper in the journal Science, the American utilities were spending over $6 million in research on various aspects of acid rain. Meanwhile, she noted they spent just $500,000 on research on how to actually reduce the pollutants. Before long, the industries were significantly outspending university and government researchers, and as a result of building up that body of expertise, they won for themselves prominent seats at the tables of international negotiations. Britain's nationalised Central Energy Generating Board, CEGB, worked with the Coal Board to campaign on the basis that fossil fuel emissions were harmless because they were natural. The argument was all about doubt around the science and the cost of taking action. The technology for flue gas desulfuration was relatively new, very expensive, and the industry wasn't going to go there without a fight. So they came up with whatever arguments they could. For instance, they questioned whether reductions in sulfur dioxide would actually result in proportional reductions in acid rain. The argument was that the role of oxidants in the formation of acid rain was poorly understood. So it could be that large emission reductions might only have a marginal benefit. They also challenged the research into the environmental impacts. So one of the clearest negative impacts was the apparent devastation of marine environments, with fish and other aquatic life dying in the affected areas. Biologists Hans Martin Seep and Arne Henriksen had produced a report primarily along the Tovdal River in Norway, looking at the effect of snow melt on fish fatalities. The biologists argued that the fish died after rapid snow melting lowered the pH in the river, which led to a loss of sodium and chloride nutrients in the blood of the fish. That could be the mechanism by which it killed them. The industry scientists attacked the study, claiming it was fraudulent because they'd spotted that one of the 5 locations was from a different river. It seemed to have been an oversight by the biologists how it was presented in the paper. It didn't actually materially affect the results. If you removed that site's data from the study, you got the same outcome. Nevertheless, they promoted the disparity as evidence of ill intent. They also located a critic of the main project, Ivan Rosenqvist, who believed that changes in land use were the cause of the increased acidity, not acid rain, and the industry groups then adopted that argument as a key research area. So the following year, they sent some of their own scientists to the Tovdal River to investigate the alternative hypothesis. Acids produced by land change use would have been weak acids, as opposed to the strong acids from atmospheric pollution. So they did tests during the spring snow melt to see which acids were the ones that were involved. In the event, what they found supported the acid rain hypothesis, not the land use alternative. And then, against the better judgment of the lead scientist involved, those conclusions were removed from the study before publication. In that case, the UK body, the CEGB, didn't want to hand its opponents such a gift, so the results were doctored. The original scientists, Seep and Henriksen, returned to Czech the following year, and they published a paper in 1980 that systematically demolished the industry research, after which the argument was quietly dropped, never to be heard again. In the US, the industry group there, the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, started similar projects on the Adirondack Lakes. They looked at 3 neighbouring lakes that received the same amount of acid rain but had very different levels of pH in the water. Scientists had noted since the early days that some ecosystems seemed more sensitive to acid rain than did others, and it seemed a lot to do with the soils. So those that were largely composed of rock formations such as granite saw big impacts from acid rain. Those with other types of rock such as limestone, not so much. Those latter areas had ground that provided some degree of a buffering effect. Now, the EPRI scientists turned the question around and said that the fact that the lakes got the same amount of acid rain but had different outcomes must mean that it was altogether different factors that were to blame. Industry scientist Ralph Perhack made that case in testimony to the US House of Representatives in 1980, for instance. Ronald Reagan appointed Perhack to his acid rain task force a couple of years later. But where was the mainstream science in all this? Well, in 1980, a conference was held in Norway which received more than 100 scientific papers to summarise the state of play. It found that the impact of sulphur dioxide was indeed being carried long distances to result in acid rain. There was still only tenuous evidence for damage to vegetation and forests, but there was no longer any doubt that acid rain was causing serious changes in aquatic ecosystems. And it was suggested that chemical changes in soils from acid rain could be harmful to forests, particularly in combination with other stressors. The scientists concluded that evidence connecting power plants with acid rain was overwhelming and justified reducing emissions. The new Reagan administration took immediate action, namely by accusing the National Academy of Sciences of being biased, and then cutting off their funding for work on acid rain for the following year. In Britain, the Thatcher government was looking equally unenthusiastic about the idea of further study. But then 2 things happened that changed the dynamic. 1, the head of research of the UK industry body lobbied the Norwegians, and Hans Martin Seep decided to aggressively respond with a letter rebutting all of his claims, and that letter was copied to the UK government. Well, we now know that this letter set off wide-ranging discussions amongst British environmental officials who began to more seriously question the objectivity of the industry research. Now, that sounds crazy now, but remember, this was all new. And in the UK, the industry in those days was nationalised, so you could tell yourself that it was motivated by the public good, I suppose. And this was made all the more urgent when the first research started to come to light, showing that there was acid rain damage in Scotland and Wales. So it was now a local issue, not just a foreign one. And that shouldn't make such a difference, but, obviously it does. The second thing that happened was in West Germany. In 1981, Der Spiegel ran an explosive 3-part cover story on acid rain that shocked the entire nation. "The forest is dying," it said. "Acid rain over Germany." It coined the term Waldausspann, which means forest death, forest decline. It was triggered by the claims of Bernhard Ulrich that a major forest decline was underway in Germany, that all tree species were affected, that it was different to any known tree diseases, and it was spreading very rapidly. The article said this: "If the SO2 theory is borne out further, warns the forest botanist Schutt, an environmental catastrophe of hitherto unimaginable proportions threatens the Federal Republic. The first great forests," says the Göttingen soil researcher Professor Bernhard Ulrich, "will die out within the next 5 years. They can no longer be saved." The article carried disturbing pictures of trees in the West German Black Forest degraded and dying. Ulrich's arguments contradicted the scientific consensus of the time, But that didn't prevent a massive wave of public concern. Germany was then, as it is today, a powerful force in the European community, and Britain's membership of the EC meant that it was about to come under a lot of pressure from the other members. Newly motivated European legislators looked for ways to get around this industry-created impasse, this situation where no level of proof was ever considered sufficient to take action, and they came upon a new concept, which we now call the Precautionary Principle. The argument that you couldn't act unless you had the last scrap of definitive proof was leaving society open to potential harm, so West Germany, in consultation with the EC, established this principle that the burden of proof should be on showing that something is safe, not that it's harmful. It wasn't introduced because the politicians believed there were uncertainties in the evidence of acid rain. It was introduced because politicians who were convinced by the evidence nevertheless needed a way to defeat the coal industry's demand for more and more and more research before anything could be done. The 1985 Helsinki Protocol on acid rain was signed in Britain's absence, where signatories agreed to reduce their sulfur dioxide emissions by 30%. So the pressure continued to build. Internal discussions within the UK government focused on pretty much the impossibility of resisting the inevitable for much longer. Accordingly, the CEGB shifted its objectives from one of prevention to at least another 5 years of delay, and it proposed a joint 5-year research project with the acronym SWAP. We now know that this was an entirely bad faith initiative and designed to fend off the inevitable for long enough to be able to find a cheaper way to reduce emissions. In the event, the SWAP study actually provided cover for the Thatcher government to save face when it eventually caved. In advance of the UK taking the European Commission presidency in the second half of 1986, the government claimed that the SWAP study had provided new proof that hadn't previously existed. Certainly hadn't caved to political pressure, obviously, because Britain would never do such a thing. It was all about the science. Well, of course, there was no new proof, and the project had to be redrafted to give the appearance of it. Nevertheless, the UK joined the acid rain club, and that left the United States as the only standout. Reagan's position on acid rain had been criticised by the left, and that hadn't made the slightest difference to his re-election. So in the second term, the industry groups felt stronger than ever. They continued attacks on the scientific research and some of the individual scientists, such as Gene Likens. Eventually, Reagan's record of dismantling environmental regulations started to create something of a backlash from the American people who started to feel it had gone too far. By the time George H.W. Bush was standing for president, he felt the pressure, at least enough to make a campaign promise to tackle acid rain if he was elected, which he was. And once he became president, he was put under pressure by some of his officials to then drop the promise. But he didn't. Instead, he partnered with the Environmental Defence Fund to come up with a more business-friendly approach to the legislation, which became the cap and trade mechanism. That set a limit on emissions and issued industry permits that could be bought or sold amongst themselves depending on which power plants had the ability to make the reductions most easily. And that was largely that. The following year saw major declines in sulfur dioxide emissions, even beyond that which was legally required, because of the shift that was taking place everywhere from coal to natural gas and oil. Various countries aimed to boost recovery from acid rain with stopgap measures by liming soil, rivers and waterways. In the 1980s, Norway and Sweden began using helicopters to spread lime to buffer ecosystems and speed their recovery. Even today, some of the lakes and rivers of North America and Europe show signs of the legacy of acid rain. Some will still not support aquatic life. But over time, more sober review of the alarmist claims about forest death were shown to have been heavily exaggerated. In Norway, browning leaves and shedding needles, which had been attributed to acid rain, were found largely to have other causes, such as sea salt, drought and parasitic fungi. So where does this leave us in relation to the original question? It turns out that both Matt Ridley and Michael Mann were right. Ridley focusing on the overclaiming that took place in relation to forest dieback on the part of the media and the campaigners, as epitomised by that Der Spiegel article. Michael Mann recalled what must surely be accurate memories on the part of his in-laws of a lake that was completely clear of life. The BBC, though, by the way, was not right to talk about forests being stripped bare. Oops. So, acid rain was real. It had heavy impacts on freshwater environments. Would action have been taken on it if Der Spiegel and others hadn't whipped the population of Germany into a frenzy with exaggerated tales? We don't know for sure. We can't rerun reality and find out. I'm thinking that we would have got there in the end, but it might well have been slower. Now, bear in mind, I'm the person who says if your cause is right, then it should be supported with the truth, not with lies. And I still think that's right. Luckily, the spirit of the findings were correct, but that could so easily have turned out not to be the case. Suppose the forest dieback had been the only issue. You run the risk that the precautionary principle gets invoked whenever someone has a bee in their bonnet, and bad science and outright falsehoods could get crammed down on the rest of us, which could have all sorts of damaging outcomes. None of the breakthroughs that happened came about because politicians followed the mainstream science. In the case of Germany, it was media campaigning around the statements of an outlier voice that created political pressure from the population. In the UK, it was caving to political pressure from the European community countries as a result of that. In the US, it was candidate Bush responding to political pressure created by the backlash to 8 years of the Reagan administration. And what about that scientific advice? The industry bodies, were their scientists hopelessly compromised, or did they actually add something helpful? I've said on this channel a number of times that having challenges to the mainstream science is good when it comes to public policy issues. The scientists who worked on projects funded by the coal industries insist now that their research was unbiased and improved the understanding of acid rain. There's some evidence that their pushback had benefits. Critiques by the industry scientists pushed ecologists to refine their understanding of how acid rain damages freshwater and forest ecosystems. But there are also numerous examples of the industry scientists misrepresenting research results to policymakers or suppressing them altogether. Having a forum for constructive challenge is one thing. What we mostly have is the Wild West and a scramble for influence that may or may not be based on sound science. Well, all of those things that work in the short term create consequences for the long term. One of those consequences is the precautionary principle. I've done a video before criticising the precautionary principle because ultimately it's a cover for whatever political position you want to take. In 1992, the precautionary principle was written into the environmental accord known as Agenda 21 in the Rio Earth Summit. Another lasting legacy was the lesson that some learned that policymakers would be better served by the creation of groups of scientists that would be independent of governments or industry. And that was part of the rationale for creating bodies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that would be looked to as presenting the actual scientific consensus on a specific question. Anyway, yes, acid rain was a real thing that was solved in the end with the right legislation that turned out not to be the end of the world for the companies that fought so hard against it. Yes, a significant part of the public profile from campaigners and politicians in some countries was incorrect and massively exaggerated, unknowingly on the part of many, but certainly not all. That came to represent a public consensus, although it never represented, as far as I can see, the scientific consensus. But we didn't have an intergovernmental panel on acid rain whose word would be taken as representing the scientific community, so that fact wasn't really appreciated at the time. Now, we've moved on a lot since then. But when it comes to how we get public policy informed by but not a slave to the science, I think we've still got some way to go.